all slaves are free on French soil. It is a little-known fact that mainland France, as opposed to its colonies, has a surprisingly good track record on slavery, with an abolition movement reaching back all the way to the Middle Ages, back when slavery was still an unquestioned part of life all over the world. Step by step, France developed the free soil principle, granting freedom to anyone who set foot on French soil. Unfortunately, slavery was reinstated in the French colonies starting in the late 16th century. Things then finally changed during the French Revolution, which claimed to speak for the rights of man. Emboldened by the promises of the revolution, the largest slave revolt in history broke out in Haiti. Under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the slaves took charge of Haiti. In today's lecture, we'll take an honest look at these developments.
Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start.
The abolition movement in France has a long history. The earliest evidence comes all the way from 1203, when records state that two serf brothers in the city Toulouse, that was then not part of France yet, were granted freedom. We read in a document of the time, quote, "Such is the custom in the city of Toulouse that anyone from Toulouse cannot buy any person living in Toulouse or acquire such a person in any way from anyone outside of Toulouse." In 1283, when Toulouse had become part of France, we read that slaves that visited the city were free even to disregard their master's order. We read, "It is the use and custom of Toulouse that men coming to Toulouse to take up residence, no matter where they're from, and although they may have lords, can and ought to be able to remain free from their lords, and to carry out their business without petition and the impediment or contradiction of their lords." I hope you also find this quote very remarkable for the 13th century. In 1315, King Louis X joined in. He even passed a decree that freed serfs from the royal domain, which was the part of France surrounding Paris that was under direct control of the king. The decree stated, "According to the law of nature, everyone must be born free," and for free here, he deliberately used the word franc, referring to the French people. And we continue, "Yet many have ended up in bonds of servitude, which greatly displeases us. We, considering that our kingdom is called and named the kingdom of the Franks, and wishing that the thing be in truth in accordance with its name, have ordained and do ordain that throughout our kingdom such servitude will be restored to freedom." So here in the early 14th century, we already see this strong connection between France and the concept of freedom. Later in that century, in 1373, we read in the records of Toulouse again that a Greek slave had fled from Perpignan, which was then part of Spain, and then ended up in Toulouse, where he was subsequently freed. Soon, we read, many more slaves followed. Among them were men of Moorish origin, and also Turks, Bulgarians, and Russians. In 1402, we read that 4 slaves took refuge in Toulouse, again coming from Perpignan. Their masters then made a plea for their return. But we read, "The syndic, which is a magistrate of the city, intervened, holding that by the privilege of the city, any sort of slave was free as soon as he had set foot in the outskirts or wider jurisdiction of the city." We also read of a case from 1406, when a female slave had, quote, "escaped from Perpignan to take refuge in the city. Her mistress then attempted to return her, but the Council of Toulouse responded that she should, quote, "be careful to do nothing against the privilege of Toulouse." They then added that, quote, "there had never been a case when they had to return a slave seeking refuge in the city." The governor of Perpignan then wrote a letter attempting to return her, but this too was rejected. Then 50,000 gold florins were offered, but this was also without effect. In 1450, we read that the Toulousian magistrate Jean Solassi spoke in defense of this free soil principle. He said, "Who would doubt that liberty is naturally favorable and desirable for every living being? Servitude was introduced by violence and fear, contrary to the first natural law." And this is actually the second reference in this lecture to natural law, which refers back to an ancient theory from Greece and Rome, which distinguished the arbitrary laws of kings with natural laws that can be obtained from reason. And Jean Solassi is here claiming that liberty itself is such a law. In time, the French soil principle began to spread beyond Toulouse. In 1446, Pamiers joined. We read that in that year a black slave was freed. And by the way, strangely, when black people are referred to in the Middle Ages, the text mostly referred to Moors, or Muslims from Spain and Northern Africa, which were often depicted with very dark skin to contrast them with the indigenous peoples of Europe. Here, for instance, we see 2 Moorish slaves brought before the king. We then read about Pamiers, quote, "Slaves could live in Pamiers in freedom." And here they use the quote, "franc et libre," which actually means freedom and freedom, but the word franc again referring to the French people. And we continue, "And as soon as the holy baptism had delivered him from servitude, he was considered a good Catholic." And here we see a picture of a Moorish man being baptized. In the second half of the 16th century, the free soil principle became widely accepted. For instance, the Parliament of Guyenne, which has Bordeaux as its capital, freed a whole shipment of slaves by a Norman merchant on the grounds that, quote, "France, mother of liberty, does not permit any slaves." And 5 years later, the political theorist Jean Bodin saw the free soil principle as a fundamental law of the French nation, stating that, quote, "Even a slave of a foreigner is free against franc et libre as soon as he sets foot in France." But while slavery remained abolished in mainland France, it was reinstated in the French colonies, conveniently out of sight of the French public. The French slave trade started in the second half of the 16th century and intensified in the 17th and 18th century. Things finally changed in the late 18th century during the French Revolution. In 1788, a year before the start of the revolution, the Society of the Friends of Blacks was founded. The organization only had a few hundred members, but among them were important Enlightenment figures, including Lafayette and Condorcet. During the French Revolution, the National Assembly of France adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. In imitation of the American Declaration of Independence, it spoke of, quote, "natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man." In time, however, the French Revolution spiraled out of control, leading to the massive murder spree known as the Terror. Yet the French Assembly did stay true to some of its progressive values. In 1791, for instance, it set the first step by granting full citizenship to all free men of color in the colonies. Initially, however, the Assembly was not willing to abolish slavery itself. But remarkably, the otherwise horrific Robespierre, who actually led the Terror, claimed he was disgusted that the National Assembly gave, quote, "constitutional sanction to slavery in the colonies." He demanded equality for all people of all colors, as not to, quote, "compromise the interest humanity holds most dear, the sacred rights of a significant number of our fellow citizens." Unsurprisingly, however, the new law to grant citizenship to free men of color was not received well by the colonists of Saint-Dominique, which is now called Haiti in the Dominican Republic. In protest, the landowners on that island decided to ignore the law, and this turned out to be a big mistake. In 1791, emboldened by the French Revolution, An estimated 20,000 slaves rose up against their masters in what became one of the largest slave revolts in history, on par with Spartacus's revolt against Rome. And then, in 1794, as the fighting on the island persisted, the National Assembly back in France made the historic move to abolish slavery in all French territories. This was a groundbreaking decision in world history, although it turns out it would only last for 8 years. In 1801, the black rebel leader Toussaint Louverture managed to become the de facto ruler of Saint-Dominique of Haiti. He had been born a slave, had actively taken part in the revolt from the start, and used the language of rights and equality from the French Revolution to make his case. And although the island was still technically in French hands, Louverture published his own constitution, which affirmed that slavery was illegal. And it also allowed all men, whatever their color, to apply for any position in government. And then he made himself governor for life. Yet, when Napoleon came to power, he sent his army over and had Toussaint shipped to France, where he died in prison 1 year later. Napoleon also reopened the slave trade, yet he could not hold on to Saint-Dominique, which became independent in 1803 under the name Haiti. Slavery was finally permanently abolished on all French territory in 1848. And there we have it, the story of the abolition of slavery in France. Thanks for watching. And if you want to read more about the history of slavery or its abolition, or many other topics from world history, read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can buy it on Amazon, or you can read it for free on worldhistorybook.com. Bye bye.